Even if I hated Tbilisi, which is far from being the truth, I would have to say that I like being here and thanks for having me. But you can ask Giga privately. I absolutely, as the Brazilians would say, adore coming to your country. I love coming to your country. And I love being in Tbilisi. And sometimes it doesn't happen very often, but for random reasons, I'm going to speak about that in the lecture. You have this feeling you are, in a very short moment, you're at the place where you're supposed to be and where you want to be. I mean, it's like finding where you belong in the cosmos. And both yesterday evening, no, yesterday afternoon, yesterday evening, and today in the morning, I had the feeling I really want to be in Tbilisi. It's kind of richtig. It's right to be here. And I wanted to thank you all for that, because that's the third time, and the friendliness and the welcome and also the resonance, I think, that I found intellectually was not only moving, but also I feel it was intellectually first rate. So the combination to come because I love the country, I love the food, I love the wine. I have many friends, and I feel it's always a challenge to speak here. And to speak to you is something I wanted to thank you for. Also because I want to get re-invited. So, okay. Now, also thanks for letting me speak about Silicon Valley. This especially goes to Tico and to Giga, because I proposed a couple of topics, and I didn't know whether the Silicon Valley topic, and this is about, of course, electronic technology, was a welcome topic. And I thank you for letting me speak about that, because I have to announce I will not extend or confirm what I perceive as the mainstream line of talking, of discourses about Silicon Valley. I mean, when intellectuals talk about Silicon Valley all over the world, it's by obligation negative. I'm not going to be by obligation positive because I live in Silicon Valley, because I don't even own a cell phone. I don't even have a handy, as they say in German. So, I mean, Giga and Tico can confirm that I'm the furthest away from using electronic technology, and yet I find it is an interesting place. Now, what are, in my perception, the two mainstream criticisms? So one, I identify as very European, and I don't know whether this is also true for Georgia. I haven't talked much with people about electronic technology. I mean, I realize that everybody uses it in Tbilisi as in any other place of the world. But in Europe, there is a certain condescending attitude. Yeah? I mean, there's a feeling of being superior to what Silicon Valley is. I mean, there is a discourse that is ironic about the naiveness of the Silicon Valley protagonists, and there is always a prediction of the imminent ending. Tomorrow it will collapse. To give you an example, probably you all know this electric car that's being produced in Silicon Valley, Tesla. If you check the German media, there is not one day where they do not cover an accident by a Tesla. I mean, as if Mercedes or BMWs or Audis would never have an accident. But the Tesla has more accidents, so it's very, very dangerous to drive a Tesla. I know it's not, because my wife has one. And then there is an internal American criticism, especially from the East Coast, because, of course, for you, probably you think of the United States of America, if you ever think of them at all. But East Coast culture and West Coast culture is very, very different. And I, living on the West Coast, perceive an envy of the East Coast, right? I mean, the economic center of the US is clearly Northern California, is Silicon Valley. And in the American intellectual culture, both on the East Coast and at this other university, as we say at Stanford, Berkeley, because there's a rivalry between Berkeley and Stanford, both academically and athletically. When they play football against each other, that's really, really a tough game. That's really, really derby. So among American intellectuals, there is a culture of self-flagellation. Yeah, said, oh my God, we Americans always produce the worst thing for humankind. And there is a kind of common denominator of the European criticism and of the intra-American criticism. And I would say it's a kind of soft Marxism. Yeah? I mean, the presupposition is that when people talk about late capitalism, that the end of capitalism is near. That might be a good thing if the end of capitalism was near, but I don't see any symptoms. I don't even see an alternative. But there's always the implication of that discourse is something will soon come to an ending. Now, as I have been a professor at Stanford for almost 30 years, I went to Stanford in '89 and I retired this past June, and I definitely will continue my life in California. I have no... I mean, if somebody offered me a position at Ilia University, I might consider that, but definitely I will not go back to Central Europe. And as you may know, Silicon Valley really emerged out of Stanford. I mean, it is where it is because the university was there first. I have a different take on it. I mean, I have different perspectives on it. One take is genealogical or historical. I mean, just I give you a couple of facts why one can say, has to say, that Silicon Valley emerged out of Stanford. This is actually quite interesting. The first thing that emerged out of Stanford was not technology, but an idea. And this was the idea of the startup. Yeah, you all know this word startup that one associates above all with electronic technology. But the idea of the startup, actually, which I think was a genius idea, was the idea of a Stanford dean of engineering. His name was Terman. And he produced this idea of the startup in a time when Northern California had almost no industry. The only industry was wine industry, Napa Valley, and it was completely agricultural. There was no high-tech industry. So that meant that the graduates of the School of Engineering didn't find jobs. And this is when Terman suggested this startup. That was his invention as a word and as a concept. I mean, he recommended the few industries that existed in Northern California to support competitors, young competitors. You may know the metaphor that the large company that finances a startup is the angel. Yeah? And why should you support competitors? I would say you don't support competitors because having competitors makes you better. So it's an ultra-capitalistic idea. Yeah? I mean, you produce your own competition, and if they are good, you may try to buy them up. But the idea was an idea completely independent of electronic industry, and it was floating in California. People found it interesting, but there was not much of startups. But this was in the 1930s. 1937, actually, he wrote for the first time about startups. And then the first chip was built. And that was actually Hewlett and Packard, who then founded their company, H&P, that still exists. Actually, the Packard family was paying my chair, my endowed chair, was paying my salary for it, so I have to be grateful to the Packard family. Everything, I don't know whether they ever realized that, everything that gets invented in America, there's always a mythology, it got invented in a garage. And if you go to Palo Alto, which is the small town, 60,000 people, where Stanford lies, there is indeed a garage. That's a national monument today. It's declared national monument. This is where the first chip is built. The university pretends this is a lie. The chip was really built in the engineering department at Stanford, where Hewlett and Packard were graduate students. But anyway, with the first chip built in the mid-1940s, that is the real beginning of electronic industry. And that is also the beginning of the startup becoming not only an idea, but becoming a reality. And then when the chip industry got really going, and that's the third step, Silicon Valley got its name because the hardware for the first chips, this is no longer the case, was silicon. And this was the first time that this material was used, and that left the name. By the way, it's not a valley. Yeah, in American English, when you say valley, you mean region. So it's completely flat. I mean, the Pacific is on the one side. There's a little mountain range on the other side. It's absolutely not a valley. But this was the time of the hardware. Now today, if you look at Silicon Valley, you would in the first place not recognize that this is an industrial region. There are no chimneys, there are no factories in the traditional sense. It's actually quite bucolic, but it is economically very, very strong. Today, what is being produced above all in Silicon Valley is software. And actually not so much applications. I mean, applications are produced all over the world, for example, in Hyderabad, in India, et cetera, et cetera. This in the center of the production and also of the intellectual life in Silicon Valley today is artificial intelligence. The fascination of Silicon Valley today is artificial intelligence, although artificial intelligence doesn't produce any income. But companies like Google, Apple, Facebook, and so forth are so wealthy that today, more than the university, they finance the research, the avant-garde of artificial intelligence, and we'll talk about that. So that's a very brief history of Silicon Valley, why it's called Silicon Valley, why it is related to the university. Now, at present, what's the present situation? So I give you a couple of views on that. In the first place, of course, the existence of Silicon Valley is very good for our students. I mean, all our computer science, electrical engineering, or also symbolic system students, they get jobs immediately in very highly paid jobs. That is good for the university, but the interesting thing is that Silicon Valley also hires people who did not graduate in engineering. There was actually surprisingly 1 year where they hired more graduates from the humanities than from engineering. They didn't realize that, and we did a colloquium and then asked them, why did you hire people from the humanities, from philosophy, literature, history? They said, oh, we don't check what their major is, what their emphasis is. We just hire entertaining people. We don't want to be bored by them. And if humanists are entertaining, we hire humanists. It is actually interesting that today at Stanford, I don't know how familiar you are with the American university system, college studies, the first 4 years of study, are studium generale. I mean, you cannot just study one thing, and it's not meant to prepare you for a profession. You're supposed to study what you're most interested in, and your emphasis is called a major. And today we have actually a major. You can study computer science, and at the same time, any type of literature. You can German literature, French literature, comparative literature, and so forth and so forth. And our colleagues from computer science tell us this is the elite of their students, the best programmers, the people who write code best. They normally do a humanities major at the same time, which is a completely new situation. And my last years of teaching were really dominated by this new type of intelligence that we had in our classrooms. So Silicon Valley gives our students jobs and gives our students a perspective. And of course, we also profit enormously from the donations. I mean, to give you a number, the average donation that Stanford receives per year is over $1.5 billion. So that is pretty heavy. And it is interesting, I don't know about this, I don't think there's much of a tradition of fundraising in Georgia, but first generation wealthy people never donate because they're scared that they might lose the money. So donation is a thing of a second generation. And you can clearly see that Silicon Valley is now a second and third generation because they enormously donate. But the one thing that really matters to me, and that is very, very difficult to explain, and to a certain degree, this is really what I want to talk about, is that I'm deeply convinced that my proximity, and I mean spatial proximity, I'm living in Silicon Valley, was very, very important for my own intellectual life. I mean, until recently, I'd never written about Silicon Valley, and I don't know the first thing about writing code, I mean, about programming or anything like that, and I will never learn that. I've always been very bad in mathematics. And yet, I think, and I'm using a metaphor that is very frequently used in the United States, there are vibrations. I mean, I feel that this proximity, to be at a place of which I think this is where the 21st century is happening, turned out to be very, very inspiring for my own work. I mean, it is interesting that Stanford is not called Stanford Technical University, but Stanford follows the description of a technical university, like the best continental European university. You know what the highest ranked continental European university is? And it's a technical university, and that's interesting. And I once had a student do statistics about which universities have risen the most in the last 25 years, and it is always technical universities that do have humanities. And that's the case with the ETH, that's the case, for example, with the best university in Germany, which is Aachen, actually, a technical university that has humanities, right? So that is interesting, and in that sense, you could say that Stanford is a technical university. Yeah, it's like MIT, it's a technical university. But we do have humanities, they are comparatively small, But of course, I'm very proud to say, since there is a world ranking of the humanities, this has been the case now for 4 years, we have always been number 1 or number 2. Yeah? And I don't think this is because I am there. I think this is precisely this proximity, almost in a Hegelian sense. So you are living and you have the challenge of where things are really happening. Now, what is my attitude towards Silicon Valley? It is not only positive, but I have to admit that is not typical for an intellectual. I can well live in the middle of capitalism. I can well live in the middle of capitalism. I imagine that I would also be able to live in the middle of socialism. I don't know whether I would have been able to survive Soviet socialism, but I could well imagine that. And what I want to say to provoke you for the discussion is that I do not think it is the main task of an intellectual, and I consider myself a humanities professor and an intellectual. I think one has to be an intellectual to be a good humanities professor. I don't consider it my obligation to have a well-circumscribed political position. I mean, that's important for politicians. I consider it my obligation to practice riskful thinking. And that means to think about things, to make them more complex, to produce perspectives that normally don't exist. So this perspective of self-flagellation about Silicon Valley, this perspective of European condescendence, maybe they are right, but that already exists. So what I really will try to do today is to give you a different view on Silicon Valley, and I hope we then have a discussion. Now, let me briefly explain the title. Yeah? Does Silicon Valley have or need an epistemology? I'm using epistemology very much in the sense that Michel Foucault gave to that word. Nobody was using that word before Foucault, and episteme, nobody was using that, meaning the structure of knowledge. Yeah? Now, if you take that seriously from an anthropological or sociological point of view, of course the answer is yes. There is no cultural formation, there is no technology that does not have an epistemology. So the answer is already yes, Silicon Valley does have an epistemology. The question is really, and this will be the vanishing point of my lecture, the question is, does it need one? Does it have to be aware of its own epistemology? Because in the humanities you would normally say you have to be aware of your own epistemology, but we'll see whether this is really true. Now, this was all preliminary, and you would say that after 30 years in the United States, I'm still very German, because I pass about 50% of a lecture with preliminary reflections. There will be one more preliminary reflection, and that is the menu of my lecture. What is the structure of my lecture? Yeah, before I give the structure of your lecture, you already have to leave. So, okay. The lecture has 5 parts, and what I try really is to surround this topic from different perspectives. I will start with a Hegelian, and I mean the philosopher Hegel, view on Silicon Valley, because my thesis is that if Hegel was resurrected today and would ask himself a question he was obsessed with, where is the world spirit living? He would have to say today Silicon Valley, and not because of us Stanford professors, but because of the people who write code. I think this is the central intellectual activity today, and not only in Silicon Valley. This will be the first part. In the second part, I want to talk about a paradox, a strange paradox. And the paradox is the following. I think it is obvious to say that electronic technology has eliminated the importance of space for human existence. Huh? I mean, thanks to electronic technology, or due to electronic technology, if my wife wanted to be present here, but she doesn't like my lecture, so she doesn't want to be present, but she could be present in real time. So that would be perfectly possible. I mean, everybody who participates in electronic communication can be omnipresent, which in the olden days when I was born, omnipresence was a divine predicate. Today we can all be omnipresent, so space is eliminated. But at the same time, and this is very strange, I mean, everybody wants to live in Silicon Valley. There is a huge congestion, the symptom being that the real estate prices are absolutely mind-boggling. So you pay for a 1-bedroom apartment, 20 square meters, that is around 1 mile around Google, you pay up to $7,000 per month. Yeah? And still, I mean, would say, why don't you produce your software in Tbilisi, or where the real estate is cheaper than that, right? I think it's not quite that level. Yeah, somewhat cheaper, but it's even cheaper in San Francisco. No, everybody wants to live there. That's a paradox. Why is this? So why does everybody want to live in Silicon Valley? And that will take me to an attempt to describe the mood, the atmosphere, the Stimmung of Silicon Valley. Yeah, this is, I think, something new. Describe why are people more productive? That's what they believe. Why do they write code better when they are in Silicon Valley? The third reflection is about, and probably some of you have heard this word, quote unquote, singularity. And singularity is the concept that is used when people talk about artificial intelligence and precisely talk about what the world might be like if we end up producing an intelligence that is not only superior to human intelligence, but also independent of human intelligence. That is clearly a situation full of risks. So why do programmers do that? Do they want that? So this is the third reflection, is going to be about singularity. And in the fourth and fifth reflection, I try to keep my promise from the beginning. I will try to give you my hypothesis, my view of the epistemology of Silicon Valley. What is the epistemology of Silicon Valley? How is it different from traditional epistemologies? And finally, I'll try to give an answer, my answer to the question, does Silicon Valley need an epistemology? Or more precisely, does Silicon Valley need to be aware of its epistemology? Now, before I continue, I wanted to ask you an honest question. I mean, I'm talking about something that's far, far away in space from Tbilisi. I'm talking in American English, which means I'm using a certain language that people in the US are used to. I mean, do you follow me easily so far? Or do you follow me too easily, like it's boring? No? Okay, it's neither. Okay, the pace is right. So I'd say, I mean, as some people here already know, I love talking, which is a danger because you all want to have dinner. I'd say it will take me from now on, I make a promise, about plus minus 40 minutes. Is that okay? Can you, okay. If you want to leave before, then you can leave before. And of course, I try to get very, very interesting and to keep you here. But the language is not about the English language, but the way I talk about it. I'm saying singularity, I'm saying Silicon Valley, that's all, the presuppositions are all clear. Okay, now I'm not going to talk about Silicon Valley in the first reflection. I'm going to talk about Hegel. Yeah? And there's something strange about this obsession that Hegel had, asking himself where the spirit was residing. I mean, where the Weltgeist is residing. Why is that strange? If you think about Hegel from an ontological or epistemological point of view, it's all about the spirit. And if you ask about a space, that's a different ontology, that's a different epistemology. I mean, a space, phenomenologically speaking, is what emerges around a body. I mean, body is not something Hegel ever talks about, and yet he was obsessed with this question as a concrete question. And as you know, the answer he gave in the mid-1820s, 1825, 1826, was that the Weltgeist, was residing in Berlin, of course, because he was at Berlin, and not only at Berlin, but at his chair, yeah, at the university that is today the Humboldt-Universität, because this was where, after this departure between spirit and matter, the spirit had finally returned to matter. There were a fusion again, but a reflexive fusion. So this was Hegel's modest answer to the question where the Weltgeist resides. A little bit like myself, because I'm a former Stanford professor, and said now it is residing in Silicon Valley. What is interesting is that the young Hegel was already asking himself the same question, and this was in 1807, when he was living in Jena and tried to become a Privatdozent, and he was writing Phenomenology of the Spirit. It was not yet published, and this was the time when Napoleon occupied that part of Germany. Germany did not exist, and he saw Napoleon, I mean, randomly, coincidentally, he saw Napoleon on horseback riding through the city. And he said, he wrote his friend in a letter, Niethammer, I saw the world Geist condensated on horseback. He reaches out over all the world and he dominates the world. I find this very, very interesting. So it's about a condensation in space. That's not a metaphor. He really believed that Napoleon embodied the world Geist. Emphasize this one last time. This is it doesn't really belong to Hegel's philosophy, but he was obsessed with this question. Now, I would say there is a certain convergence with the Silicon Valley phenomenon. There is this condensation. I mean, Silicon Valley as a space is maximally 15 miles long. It's on the map. It's between San Jose, that's the southern end of the Bay of San Francisco, and Palo Alto. It's 15 miles max, and it's about 10 miles broad. And it's a huge condensation of people. The real estate price is it's not embodied in one single person. I wouldn't say that Steve Jobs was like Napoleon, but this condensation of people who write code. And today they all write code. I mean, applications are no longer done in Silicon Valley. Hardware, I mean, it's produced in China or wherever, or maybe in Georgia, I don't know, but that would be a good country to produce hardware. But they all write code. So there is this condensation. Then secondly, quoting Hegel, it reaches out all over the world because we all use this electronic technology. We may say it's horrible, it's the end of culture, but with my exception, everybody has a cell phone. Is there anybody here who doesn't have a cell phone? I mean, switch it off now, but everybody has a cell phone, right? You communicate. Is there anybody here who does not use email ever or Facebook? I mean, Facebook, some people don't use it, but because they think they're not pretty enough for Facebook. But I mean, I mean, you could actually say when people are asking me, how do you define globality? I would say globality is not synonymous with humankind, but globality is precisely the 70–80% of humans living today on the planet who are connected by electronic communication, potentially connected, even if you don't have a computer, but you have access to a computer, right? I mean, so everybody is using it. And does it dominate the world? Thank goodness, I think it does not dominate the world politically, or maybe it would be much better than Trump. I don't know. Zuckerberg, rumor has it, wants to become in the next elections, not after next elections, a Democratic candidate. But it definitely dominates the world economically. I mean, if you look at the companies in the world with the highest capital, number one is Apple, number two is Amazon, etc., etc. There is no top 10 company in the world that is not related economically to electronic technology. So in that sense, I think it is not just local patriotism if I say there is a connection between this Hegel idea and Silicon Valley. I think it's a concrete thing. It is something very similar to what Hegel in 1807 saw on horseback. I mean, this concentration and the other predicates. But if you want to think about Silicon Valley, I don't think that Hegel's epistemology is the right epistemology, because what I think is really interesting about Silicon Valley is not so much whether it's good or bad. I mean, it's way too big to say it's good or bad. It's much more complex than that. What I think is interesting about it is the energy that it has. I mean, it can be a negative energy, it can be a positive energy, but I think you need philosophical approaches, you need epistemologies that give you access to this question of the energy. I mean, for example, I'm not such a great fan, but Schopenhauer. If you think of Schopenhauer's concept of the will, that tortures humans, the will, but it always gives you energy. You can never be quiet, and that seems to be typical for Silicon Valley. I think a concept like Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, which only Adolf Hitler understood as a political concept. I mean, will to power precisely is this feeling that there is a physical surge that is intellectually inspiring. Something like that. There is that feeling when you talk to people who are writing programs. They say it's irresistible. It's an addiction. You have to do it all the time. And then there is one approach that I find very, very interesting when you think about Silicon Valley. I'm not going to elaborate that, but if you want to think about it, and this is this French anthropologist, paleontologist, André Leroi-Gourhan, who once said, and I think it's a fabulous idea, it's a simple idea, it's a fabulous idea, that what we call culture is the continuation of human evolution, of biological evolution with different means. Yeah? I mean, the last 15, 20,000 years, Middle Stone Age, we talk about human culture, and that continues biological evolution at a much higher pace. I mean, it's a continuation of evolution in an accelerated mode. And then you could say, if what we call technology emerges in early modernity, maybe it emerges actually in late medieval Italian cities like Florence, that would be yet a different stage of evolution, but at a higher pace of acceleration than culture. And one might want to say that electronic technology is yet a different chapter. I mean, I'm probably the oldest person in this room, and I can well remember a time when people thought that faxing, the fax machine, was the future, right? And if you look at fax machines today, I mean, they look as old-fashioned and just deemed to go to a museum like, you know, technology from the 16th century, right? Or to imagine, I can still imagine when in the 1990s, I was asking the Stanford provost, the chancellor of the university, ironically, I thought it was elegant European irony, so one day you will oblige us to be on email. And he said, yes, we may. And I said, come on. And of course, today, the first thing you're obliged to cannot be a professor at Stanford, and I don't think you can not work in any context today without being electronically connected. So this is what I say about acceleration, and maybe, and I will come back to this point, what we call deep learning, and I will talk about that, machines teaching themselves to learn. This is the last 3 years, is yet a different stage. And maybe the stage where artificial intelligence is beginning to get out of human control. You know, because I don't know, I mean, I will explain that a little bit later, but the people who write the algorithms for deep learning, they only know that these algorithms can teach themselves how to learn, and they do it faster and faster, but they do not understand how they do it. Yeah, so that, you get my point. I mean, I think this is an interesting line to think of. And it's not teleological in the Hegelian sense, it gets better and better. It rather is a pessimistic view. It gets faster and faster, and by getting faster and faster, it's getting more and more out of human control. So I'm not saying this is, in the 18th century sense, a line of progress. So you look like you're still entertained, right? I mean, I have this complex, I hope it's unprofessorial, that I want people to be entertained, but you have the long introduction and the first out of 4 reflections behind yourself. Now, and this is not in continuity, I want to take a different perspective. I want to think about this paradox. Yeah? How come that people pay $6,000 per month for 1-bedroom apartment if they could completely do the work in Tbilisi? I mean, it is famous for Silicon Valley companies, and it's part of the omnipresence, that there's no obligation that you do your work in Mountain View, where Google is, or in Sunnyvale, where Apple is, or in Palo Alto, where Facebook is. Right? They very explicitly state in their contracts you can do that from all over the world. I mean, they have campuses, you can work there and can also stay there for 24 hours, but there's no obligation. Why does everybody have to be there? Which I think is really interesting. We'll try to give you 2 answers. One answer is completely historical. I think that this extreme concentration in space in communities that are relatively small by present-day standards, around 100,000, has been a historical condition for top intellectual production. I give you one other fact of rankings, and then I stop talking about rankings because I know that Americans are always obsessed with rankings. Of the top 25 universities in the world, there's only 1 in a city of more than 1 million inhabitants. It's quite interesting. Huh? You would think the largest cities produce the best universities. Anybody know which one it is? Columbia University in New York, and they are only number 24. I mean, in the Chinese ranking that people normally consider to be the best or the most authoritative ranking. Yeah, so I mean, Stanford, Harvard, I mean, Cambridge, Massachusetts, a little bit over 100,000. Palo Alto, 60,000. Princeton is 20,000. Yale is at a city, 50, 60,000. So they're all very small places. Zurich is not a large city. I mean, they call it the small big city, 350,000. So this is kind of interesting. Now, if you look at that historically, think of Athens in the 5th century BC. Yeah? Athens had probably around 150,000 inhabitants. And the condensation of cultural productivity, not only aesthetic productivity, is at the beginning of Western philosophy, for example, in this very small community. Same thing about Florence in the late Middle Ages, early modernity. I mean, everything happens in Florence, artistically, intellectually. This is the invention of bad thing or good thing, capitalism. It all happens there. Migration, it all happens there, and it's again a relatively small community. The most extreme case may actually be a German case, and that was Weimar between 1780 and 1830. I mean, even the French were saying, Madame de Staël, everything intellectual happens in a small German town. You know how many people Weimar had then? 7,500. This is quite amazing. Or mathematics, for example, in Göttingen. Yeah, there's a moment when everything in mathematics happened at the University of Göttingen. And it's really very much what you call in German, for those who know it, JWD, in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's a very boring city. Train hardly ever stops in Göttingen. So, I mean, I think these moments that there's an extreme intellectual productivity, and it's in, Heidegger was saying it always has to happen in the province. Yeah? I would actually, this is again something to think for you, I don't think it happens in the provinces today, and it does have to be a vacation place. I would say today it happens in suburbia, in the periphery of big cities. Yeah, I mean, the much maligned suburbia. If you are an American intellectual, that's part of the self-flagellation to say, we're living in suburbia. It's very horrible. You have to live in a big city. You have to live in New York. But New York is completely unimportant for anything intellectually important today. It's a beautiful city, but it's definitely not an intellectual center. I mean, for example, for software, it plays zero role. Yeah, you know that Estonia, for example, that I find interesting, a country of 500,000, exports more software than Germany, and is the avant-garde in Europe in artificial intelligence. So, I mean, I find that interesting, and I mean, Tbilisi is maybe already too large, but maybe Gori. Wouldn't that be nice? I mean, I know what the implication is, so that would be the counterpoint in the history of Gori if Gori became the next center of software, because there is an ending. I'm not saying that Silicon Valley will continue forever, but I find, as a sociological, historical observation, that all the places that we have canonized of being very, very productive intellectually are small places at some periphery. It is never the economic center, it is never the center of political power. Yeah? I find that interesting and remarkable. And I don't want to present that to you with a Heideggerian provincialism and something like that. I think everything Heidegger wrote about that is absolutely abominable. Normally, although he was a Nazi, I do trust Heidegger intellectually, but not with his romanticism about the cabin in the Black Forest. No, it's not the Black Forest. It's in the periphery of big cities. It's in suburban life that intellectuals find is horrible. So that is one thing. But there's another thing I wanted to talk about, and that is important to me. And this goes back to my last seminar that I was teaching at Stanford before my retirement. And this is a seminar on the concept of bliss. I don't know whether you're familiar with this concept, not blessing, but bliss. It is a concept that is mainly used in American English today more than in British English. And if you look up in the OED, in the Oxford English Dictionary, they will tell you something, happiness or ecstatic state of happiness, extreme state of happiness. And then they give you an example, marital bliss. So can a marriage be in an ecstatic state of happiness forever? Some people say yes, some people say no. And actually the perspective of the seminar was literature and bliss. Not the description of bliss in literature, but whether literature can get you into states of bliss. This was, and then at some point, the student said, this is a very good topic. This topic concerns us existentially. And then I said, could we try out whether perhaps one could describe Silicon Valley as a state of bliss?
I mean, I have nothing invested. I have no money invested into Silicon Valley. And once again, I'm saying one last time, I don't even have a cell phone. And yes, yet this productivity, and that everybody wants to be there, and that people tell you they write code better when they are there. Yeah, I mean, all the students, for example, and can say all the people who are important in producing artificial intelligence are very, very young. And I'm saying like 20, 21, 23 years. Yeah. They don't go back for vacation home. They stay there because they say we cannot waste time. We write code better, which is very, very strange. So we did this experiment in the seminar to explore this concept of bliss, whether it can explain some Silicon Valley. And I'm doing this experiment again with you. I'm not sure that the answer is correct, but it is interesting. So first, I'm going to give you 4 aspects on bliss. So first, what would be the function of bliss? Okay, you are happy, but how can one describe that? And one student actually gave an answer which I enormously like. He says, in a situation of bliss, you have the feeling like you have reconnected with your umbilical cord to the cosmos. When you're in a situation of bliss, you feel you are in the right place. And this was a little bit what I felt yesterday about being here. I felt, not this is my home, I mean, definitely not from Tbilisi, but I felt this is where I have to be that day. Yeah, and so okay, if you're in a situation of bliss, you feel you want to be with that person or those persons at this very place in this very moment. I mean, I have it again, but that must be my Tbilisi feeling. I feel I want to be here and I want to talk for you and with you at this very moment. And bliss is part of that. So that would be one aspect. The second aspect, how do you get into a situation of bliss? Yeah, because we all know it doesn't depend just on our desire and our will. You can't say, now I'm going to be blissful. No, it doesn't happen. You get into bliss and you fall out of bliss, and you don't control it. Yeah? It is very much in the Heideggerian sense a phenomenon of Geworfenheit, of thrownness. It happens to you. Now, how can one get into a situation of bliss? I mean, we were experimenting in the seminar with the concept that, interestingly, I don't know about Georgia, but in many languages it's the most trendy concept today, and that is intensity. Now, philosophers don't talk much about intensity, but today intensity is the most positive thing and stress is the most negative thing. Although they describe the same situations. You say it's either stressful or it's a situation of intensity. The only philosopher of some prestige, not only prestige, but interesting philosopher that has ever written about intensity, and it's barely 10 pages, is Deleuze in Mille Plateaux, Deleuze and Guattari in Mille Plateaux. And I give you their definition a little bit complexified by my own definition. So, interestingly, Deleuze says a situation of intensity is always a movement. And it is a movement that starts out in a situation of total entropy, where everything is possible, and that's the problem. It's an overcomplex situation. You have so many possibilities that you don't know what to do. And then you get into this movement of bliss. This movement of bliss captures you, and it ends up in the opposite, namely, and he says metaphorically, a black hole situation. A black hole situation where everything is so highly determined that you die. Yeah? So the problem of getting into a situation of bliss would then be to use such a movement. Maybe you go to Silicon Valley and start connecting with people, and you get into this mood. You get into this very specific mood. But at the same time, it can be very addictive. It can be very addictive, and lots, I mean, there are lots of suicides in Silicon Valley, for example. So you have to try to get out of it before it becomes this black hole situation. And maybe we could say that about Silicon Valley in general. One day, it should better implode. I think this is, this in and out is almost the existential drama of Silicon Valley. Thirdly, there is a lemma of Silicon Valley that sounds very familiar, but it is not familiar. The lemma of Silicon Valley is nothing is impossible. And that is different from the traditional American lemma, namely everything is possible. Why is it different? Because if you say nothing is when you say everything is possible, you think of a project that you realize. And this puts a lot of weight on your shoulders. Whereas if you say nothing is impossible, I think you speak of an openness for events to happen, for events that you're using. Yeah? So the metaphor that you use in American English, I apologize, Giga, is a sports metaphor. For American football, you intercept an event. Yeah? Something happens, something appears to you randomly, and you use it. For example, as this happened in my hometown in Germany, do you know about the invention of X-rays? How that happened, Röntgen? He didn't try to invent X-rays. He was not even a professor of physics. He was a janitor. He didn't have an Abitur. And over the weekend, he was playing with these physical, and all of a sudden, he saw the bones in his hand. And then, yes, this was an event. He hadn't planned that, but he was using it intelligently, so much so that he received the first Nobel in physics without having a high school graduation. Yeah? I mean, that is intercepting. I mean, this is, you get my point. I mean, you could apply to Röntgen precisely, nothing is impossible. Yeah, without a high school graduation, you can win the first Nobel in physics. I found that very, very interesting. Now, what happens, however, if you are within bliss? How can you describe the inside of bliss? I mean, one thing is interesting. It is definitely not a situation of high reflexivity. I think it is a situation that you describe in American English as off or on. You know when you are in a situation of bliss, but you don't think much about it. I mean, you have to know because you enjoy it. You know you feel well, you know you are on, you know you're in good shape, but you don't think much about it. What is interesting is that while there is no semantics in any Western language, that at least what my students try to find out, there is an exact equivalent of the word bliss in Hindi. And you may have heard that word, it's Ananda. Yeah? I mean, I don't know Hindi, I'm not pretending I know Hindi, but we had 2 Indian students in the seminar. And Ananda has enormous semantics. I mean, all of traditional Indian poetology describes Ananda, and we use that for Silicon Valley. Now, what is Ananda? I mean, Ananda in the first place, and I found that interesting, neutralizes the difference between the greatest pain and the greatest joy. I think that is very, very interesting. If you think, I mean, I don't know whether there's anybody here is familiar with troubadour songs, medieval troubadour songs. And it's a leitmotif in the troubadour songs to say the greatest pain is the greatest joy. I mean, troubadour songs are always about a tragic form of love. Yeah, it's never consummated ultimately. But nevertheless, this frustration is something positive, very strange. So this is neutralization. I mean, the German word, for those who know German, Leidenschaft, it's a positive word, but it's a positive word about pain. So it's a passion for pain. Yeah, very strange. Secondly, and that I find particularly interesting, Ananda emphasizes the sweetness. Yeah? Ananda emphasizes the sweetness, and the one metaphor that is always being used is honey. Now, honey is interesting. It's sweet, but it is also a fluidity. It is a slow fluidity. Yeah? And maybe my association with this slow fluidity would be an association with imagination. When you imagine things, this is not like having a concept, like having a definition, but imaginations are slowly moving. You cannot capture them. And they may have this sweetness where the greatest pain and the greatest joy are synonymous. And then finally, now I'm applying it to Silicon Valley. What I find interesting when you talk to people who write code, I mean, who produce artificial intelligence today, they will all tell you about a strange asymmetry in their production. And this asymmetry, they express this asymmetry like this. Our hands, so what we are writing into the keyboard, always are a couple of seconds or a fraction of a second ahead of our reflection. So they feel if you know what you want to do, if you try to solve a problem, it will not work. Yeah, I mean, if you start an artificial intelligence problem trying what would be the best approach. There are so many approaches that no machine can reduce them. So you have to follow your intuition, and you have to maintain this asymmetry between your intuition and your processing of the intuition. You get this point? I find this very, very interesting. And I would say this is something that you can associate with bliss. You can associate with this description, nothing is impossible. Yeah? I mean, you get my point. It is not only not intentional, when it becomes more intentional, when it becomes what research projects normally are. I don't know about Georgia, but in Germany, if you want money for a research project, you already have to present the solution. You know, 'cause why did you get money for this research project? So artificial intelligence, the development of artificial intelligence, but even writing applications is the opposite. Yeah, you have to let go. You have to let go, and you have to not process your intuition too fast. And now I have to look what my next topic would be. Yeah, that's singularity. Artificial intelligence and singularity, which, as I was saying, is really the central fascination of the elite. I mean, and by elite, I'm not talking about Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. I'm talking about those who produce artificial intelligence today, and that is really the central point. Let me talk for a moment about deep learning, what is being called deep learning. This is a threshold that people are saying happened like 3-4 years ago in the development of artificial intelligence. Until then, everything that was artificial intelligence tried to copy either the human brain or the human consciousness, or both. Yeah, that is no longer the case. Yeah? Today, deep learning means that you present to an algorithm, not really to a machine, but to an algorithm, a huge amount of data, and you realize that the machine teaches itself, so to speak, the algorithm teaches itself to process those data faster and faster. The strangest thing, they get a bonus every day. When the programmer observes that the algorithm goes faster and faster, they get points, as if they got food or something like that. I have no understanding what that means, but the interesting thing is, that's all they can do. So you get my point. They know how you can, speak metaphorically, motivate the algorithm to do the learning faster and faster and faster, but they do not know what the algorithm is actually doing. And I sometimes feel, and that's a pessimistic point of view, this may be the beginning of artificial intelligence running out of control. Huh? I mean, today you can still pull the plug if it gets too dangerous. It still needs electricity, but there is something happening that is no longer under control, and the acceleration is extreme. I mean, they say the acceleration is exponential. I mean, because from week to week, those programs work faster and more efficiently. Now, what would singularity be? I mean, of course, you can think singularity would be that this superior intelligence finds humans very, very interesting, and they found something like the European Union, right? A federation. So we have artificial intelligence on the one side and humans on the other side. But it could also be that this artificial intelligence finds humans absolutely abominable, ecologically unacceptable, and would just eliminate them. Yeah? That would be Adolf Hitler's golden dream realized by artificial intelligence. My greatest nightmare is actually, and I'm using a very American word, that artificial intelligence would maybe find us cute. And they would establish something like a zoo with humans, or as you say in German, a Streichelzoo, yeah? A pet zoo. So artificial intelligence with their children, they wouldn't have children probably, they would come over the weekend, oh my God, humans are so naive and so cute, and we really like humans. And you would spend your whole life, you wouldn't be allowed to commit suicide because that would be too costly and ecologically bad, but you spend your whole life in a zoo. I think the elimination would be much better, right? Now, the interesting thing is that the avant-garde people of artificial intelligence, and I'm talking about a couple of students who do this double major in computer science and comparative literature. One of them, I mean, Giga has read about him. is just got 21 years old, so he is now allowed to drink wine in a restaurant in the US. And he found, it's very funny, he's from an Orthodox Jewish family, and his roommate is Palestinian. And they founded a startup together. In the startup, they don't do artificial intelligence. The startup is something completely different. And the startup is estimated $1 billion, can you believe it? But the startup is not interesting for them. They do the startups to prove themselves they can do it. What they're really interested in is artificial intelligence. And then ask them, but don't you realize what you are producing? Don't you realize the danger? And they will tell you, and this is also Silicon Valley, we realize the danger, but it's addictive. You cannot not do it. The fascination to see what will happen if this intelligence ever emerges, and they say we don't know when it emerges. It may already have begun to emerge. It may never emerge. It may emerge in 100,000 years. We do not know, but to contribute to know what this will be, and I'm deliberately using a Heideggerian concept, this unconcealment of singularity. Yeah? This event is so fascinating that it is addictive and we cannot not do it. And if it ever got prohibited, and they say this is true for everybody who's involved in artificial intelligence, they would secretly do it. Yeah, I mean, I think, so this discussion that Elon Musk had with Zuckerberg, shall one just stop it, would be inefficient because the people are doing it. And if they, once again, if you ask them, but this would be so bad for humankind, they say, we don't care. Now, I mean, as my own quote-unquote ethical footnote, I normally try to avoid the word ethics because I think as a professor you always have an authority, and then professors talk about ethics, they normally tell people to lead their lives the way they lead their lives, and I don't think that my life has any exemplary value for anybody. I'm happy to get along with my own life. But, as a footnote, you say, well, this would be the extermination of humankind. I mean, in the first place, and thinking in an evolutionary way, why should humankind be the only species ever that would not come to an ending? Yeah, I mean, this is not only for dinosaurs. I mean, why would the ending of humankind not precisely be, and in that sense the humans would be different from dinosaurs, an ending to which they themselves contribute? You get my point? I think actually from an ecological point of view, I'm not so ecological, but lots of people care about ecology. From an ecological point of view, this ultimate attempt, no, humankind has to survive forever, this eternization of humankind is highly problematic. So, and I'm not saying this is some penalization of humans because they have behaved so badly, but maybe that would be an ending, and I'm talking seriously. The question that would fascinate me if I was younger than I am now is whether there is a way of finishing humankind in a dignified way. Yeah? So to go out, to leave the planet, leave the cosmos in a dignified way. I mean, I don't even know exactly what that would be, but to think, oh, we will stop that, the more I think about it, the more unlikely it is. And maybe we are already in this movement. Okay, so final stretch. No, I haven't been too long by my standards. I can speak much longer, and I'm also hungry. So what is then the epistemology of Silicon Valley? Yeah? This is not repeating my thesis about bliss. I mean, I step back and I say, every phenomenon, every cultural phenomenon in the large sense, like Silicon Valley, has an epistemology, and what is specific about it. And I'm concentrating on Silicon Valley today, meaning not on hardware, not on applications, but I'm concentrating on what I think is this intellectual center, which is the reason why I'm saying this is where the 21st century is happening, and that is writing code, as they say, instead of programming, producing artificial intelligence. That's what I really refer to when I'm saying this is where the 21st century is happening. And there you see, I'm not talking of a history of progress. Yeah, I'm talking at a history which at best, the situation is very ambiguous, because it may well be the self-produced ending of humankind. Yeah? Now, what I think is epistemologically characteristic of the Silicon Valley situation today, and now I'm using for once a distinction that Heidegger produced, who, by the way, and as a footnote, I think was absolutely not anti-technological. He admired technology much more than science. I mean, like myself, he wasn't using technology, and unlike myself, he was very fond of the Black Forest and of the cabinet and so forth and so forth. But if you read Heidegger's production of the last 20 years, it's actually always said, no, the unconcealment of being will happen in technology. I think that's what he meant. But anyway, I'm using this distinction between Vorhanden and Zuhanden. So Vorhanden, present at hand, I think refers to the classical paradigm from early modern European philosophy, subject-object. Yeah? So you stand in front of the world, you're an observer of the world, and you analyze or describe the world. And in doing so, you produce truth. You produce conceptual descriptions that you claim correspond to the material reality. Is that clear? That's Vorhanden. Now, Zuhandenheit, ready to hand, is a very different relationship. Ready to hand is a relationship where you are extremely familiar with your environment, and you always know spontaneously, think of my hand is ahead of my thinking. You always know spontaneously what you're doing, but you don't produce truth. You produce what you call in German Richtigkeit. And this is what these artificial intelligence people will tell you. My intuition is always ahead of my conceptualization, and what matters is that the algorithm runs. You get my point? I mean, the algorithm running is not a truth. It doesn't represent anything. It just means the movement is going on and on and on. So the epistemology of Silicon Valley today, I think, is an epistemology of Zuhandenheit, of ready to hand, an epistemology that does not produce truth, that does not produce ethical claims, that produces algorithms running. And maybe, I mean, not only algorithms running, but the society running. Because that is the one thing I can say as an eyewitness, so to speak. I mean, if you are, for example, like many of those students who are producing artificial intelligence, who are going to Stanford, if you fulfill your obligations, you will be successful. And I do think this, if you ever go there, there is a certain happiness. I mean, it is very, very problematic if you don't make it. Yeah? But there is an upbeatness to that life that is also the life is running. I mean, I could tell you endless stories about my own children. None of them is anything academic, but for example, my younger son, who didn't even finish college, more than half of American citizens finish college, but he's running a very beautiful, a very successful restaurant. He had no education to do that. But it's a very typical Silicon Valley thing. Yeah? I mean, you do it well, and you keep your life running. You have no truth about that. But before I tell you stories about my children, I wanted to insist that this running is as far away from a classical science epistemology, from Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics, Mr. Newton is observing the material world and is finding out regularities that he claims are truth. And this is, of course, a fantastic and one of the great triumphs, really, of human intellectual culture. And I'm not saying it's inferior to this running of Silicon Valley, but it is something really, really different. And perhaps we could say, and this is the last Heidegger concept with which I'm bothering you, that singularity, should it ever happen, because nobody knows what it would be. Yeah? Would they exterminate humans? Would they do a federation with humans? Would they make us their pets, like the way we use cats or dogs, or something like that? We don't know. We have no clue. So maybe singularity would not be a truth. Singularity would be an unconcealment of being. Yeah? Something shows itself, and by showing itself, it will have consequences for humans that we cannot resist. I mean, it is not like, I mean, when I try to explain the unconcealment of being, and it's a very brutal concept, I used to use Hiroshima. Yeah? as the unconcealment of energy. I mean, nobody really, when they dropped this bomb on August 6, 1945, I mean, not one of the glories of the nation I'm a citizen of, clearly, but I'm not saying they didn't know what it would be because, say, oh, you know, had they known, they wouldn't have dropped the bomb, but the impact, both the physical impact, the existential impact, the genetic impact, and so forth, was in this very brutal way an unconcealment of being. So I do think that ultimately the epistemology is an epistemology on the one hand of ready-to-hand and Richtigkeit, ready-to-hand and machines and programs running, and at the same time maybe ultimately of an unconcealment of being. So now I can breathe very deeply because I think there are about 90 seconds left, okay? And thanks for your patience, and thanks for at least looking at me as if you were interested. I mean, it's a very... No, I'm not done. Sorry, no, that was bad now. Now I think I should... No, okay, 90 seconds, not minutes. Seconds. Does Silicon Valley need an epistemology? Yeah? I mean, I've said it has an epistemology. Now, what I find interesting is that those people who explicitly talk about Silicon Valley, we even use the word of Silicon Valley, who will promise you things like Silicon Valley will make humankind very happy, or Silicon Valley is a danger. I mean, like Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. Zuckerberg was saying, no, artificial intelligence can always pull the electricity and then it would be all over. And Elon Musk, you know these names, right? I mean, it's the Tesla guy was saying, no, we have to start populating Mars because maybe, you know, artificial intelligence cannot reach us there. I mean, they have their epistemology, so to speak. But what I find interesting is they are no longer part of the intellectual operation that is Silicon Valley. I mean, people who know him say that the young Zuckerberg, who was a Harvard student, invented Facebook and so forth, that he was genius writing code, but he has long not invented a new algorithm. Yeah? Elon Musk was never doing that. I mean, I have a very high opinion. I think it's a fascinating character of Steve Jobs, but Steve Jobs was never writing algorithms. Yeah? My point, therefore, is that there's a difference between the face of Silicon Valley, that would be Zuckerberg, that would be Musk, that used to be Steve Jobs, who produce an epistemology, so to speak. They wouldn't know that word, but they talk about it like it is an epistemology. But for the actual intellectual movement, it would actually be counterproductive to have an epistemology because it wouldn't allow you to follow your intuition. So my answer to the title question is Silicon Valley obviously has an epistemology, but for the intellectual intensity of Silicon Valley, it is much better to not be aware of it. Now you can clap if you want.